All right, so this is for part B of number 6, and we really have the idea now. In fact, part B is a little bit easier than part A, and it's really the same idea here, which is that now we're told that the intertemporal substitution effect on leisure decreases. So what in the world does that mean? Half of the battle in this question is figuring out what is it that I'm trying to say here. And what I'm trying to say is that the intertemporal substitution effect on leisure is the following. As R goes up, we talked about this in the answer to the last question. When the real interest rate goes up, that affects the cost of borrowing or the benefit of saving. Right? So when R goes up, I don't want to borrow as much. Or if I'm saving, I want to save more. Right? I want to take advantage of the higher real interest rate. So as students, when the real interest rate goes up on your student loans, you want to take out fewer loans. So how do I do that? Is I'm going to work more. And remember, what that ultimately implies, or where that's coming from, is that I'm going to have less leisure, right? So I want to make more income today to either take advantage of the higher interest rate on savings, or to not borrow as much and get dinged on the interest that I'm going to pay on my loans. So that's the intertemporal substitution effect on leisure, which is that leisure today has become more expensive relative to leisure in the future. Leisure in the future is now cheaper than leisure today. I can save a bunch today, get the benefit of that savings in the future, and enjoy my leisure then, as opposed to enjoying the leisure today. So what we're saying then is that effect gets smaller. So let's say, we start with an interest rate of 5%. And when that's the case, I choose leisure equal to 10. All right, so with H equal to 24, that means I work 14 hours, H minus L. All right, so I work 14 hours when R1 is 0.05. And when the real interest rate increases, my leisure is going to decrease. So let's say that that's a relatively large effect. My leisure goes from 10 hours to 5 hours. With H equal to 24 then, my labor supply is going to be 19. All right, so I get a 5-hour increase in my hours worked. Now that's a relatively fast increase, or a relatively large intertemporal substitution of leisure effect. Now if that gets smaller, let's say, so this is the smaller. When that gets smaller, maybe my leisure only goes down by 1 hour when the real interest rate increases. And so that's going to imply that my hours worked only goes up by 1 instead of 5. So that's a decrease in the intertemporal substitution of leisure effect. So how does that affect output supply? Is going to be to make it steeper. Because labor supply isn't going to shift as much in response to a change in the real interest rate. So we go back to how did we derive output supply? Was to use our labor market and our production function. Sorry, it's not R there. This is Y. And that gives me a point, R1 and Y1. And so if we have a big intertemporal substitution of leisure effect, we get a big shift in labor supply. That causes a big increase in N and a big increase in Y. So it's going to probably get a little bit messy, but I'll try to keep it as clean as I can. So the bigger the increase in Y there, the flatter aggregate supply is going to be, or output supply curve is going to be. So I'll call this YS1 for the bigger effect, or YSB for a big intertemporal substitution of leisure effect. Now, when that gets smaller, my labor supply shift is smaller when R increases, and I get a smaller increase in employment, call this N3, and therefore a smaller change in Y. So I get Y3 when I go to R2. And so we can see then, if I kept doing that, I'm going to get a much steeper output supply curve. So remember, the steepness or the slope of the output supply curve depends on how much labor employment changes in response to a change in the interest rate. So that's going to depend on how much the labor supply curve shifts. Is it a big or a small shift? That's what Part B got at. And it depends on how steep is the labor demand curve, and that's what Part A was hitting on. And so as I change those shifts in the steepness of labor demand, I can get a relatively steep or relatively flat output supply curve. How steep or flat the output supply curve then is going to determine how much our economy changes in response to various events, which some of the next questions are getting after. So that's a run through. It's a very detailed question. I know it's a lot of pieces going into that, but if you really take the time and get to understand all of those details, you're going to have the foundation you need to answer any other question that I can possibly throw at you in these models.